So today I'm going to talk about Chester Gould and Dick Tracy. And what we have here is we have the complete Dick Tracy from the Library of American Comics. I have the complete collection, 29 issues, all by Chester Gould. The series ran from 1931 to 1977. The reason I'm going to talk about Dick Tracy is because I have two figures coming. It's a two figure set from Mezco featuring Dick Tracy and Flat Top Jones. So Flat Top here appeared in the Volume 9, which covered 1944 and 1945 dailies and Sundays. And Flat Top was probably his most famous creation. As almost always happened, Flat Top Jones died, was killed at the end of the story. And the character was so popular that he actually sort of brought him back as Flat Top Jr., who was pretty much a carbon copy of his dad. So Chester Gould was a very complex fellow. He was a brilliant writer and artist, and I would say that his art style evolved over the years. I've seen a lot of artists who over time their art style kind of I don't know, I guess maybe from age or whatever, they sort of lost it. Chester Gould, his art remained fantastic throughout his entire tenure, and it became more and more stylized, and he really created an iconic art style. His stories have had a kind of a tight template. He would establish a very ruthless villain. As people know, a lot of times they had names based on some kind of physical feature. And in this case, you have Flat Top, whose head is flat on top. And also in this particular volume, you have the Brow, who had a huge forehead, a huge wrinkly forehead. And they were very popular. It was really well done. Basically, he would establish how ruthless the criminal is, and then Dick Tracy would track the person down, and whether it be male or female, and you'd have generally a long series of events where the criminal's trying to get away, and often ends up in some kind of torturous situation and dead at the end. So it's kind of a revenge story with Dick Tracy meeting out the justice. So it's really well done. The problem, and I'm going to tell a lot of problems about Chester Gould, because as much as I would not have bought all of these volumes if I didn't love what he was doing. But there are serious problems. One of them, and this could be a positive or negative. He didn't really know where the stories were going as he was writing them. He didn't really plan them out, and he said he figured that if he didn't know where the story was going, then the reader wouldn't either. And that could work because it could go in some very interesting directions, but a lot of times what would end up happening is the story would go down one route, and then or things wouldn't match up because he wasn't plotting it out ahead of time. But he still did a great job of storytelling regardless. I think it is amazing the confidence he showed in killing off the villains, unlike in comic books today where you just can never get rid of a villain. One of the other problems is, and I'm going to get to bigger and bigger problems, Chester Gould wanted to be a funny writer, and he wasn't funny. A writer like L.Z. Segar, who created Popeye, he was funny. Chester Gould was not funny, and he would create these characters meant to be humorous characters, and over again, they were not well received. And I think it was frustrating to the readers. It was frustrating to the publishers. And as he got older, it was like Chester Gould got more and more stubborn. As people would say, we don't like these characters, he said, well, you know what? I'm just going to base the whole series around these characters. Or he would, at the very least, give them a very prominent role to the dismay of the readers who didn't really like them. And he had a lot of child characters that were almost carbon copies of each other. And they were annoying. And they weren't funny. And they weren't cute. It was just irritating. He also, during the 60s, he was trying to evolve. The problem was, it was like, the series, it feels like a kind of it's a kind of a time capsule between the 1930s and the 1970s, but Chester Gould didn't seem to adapt to the times. He was creating more and more technology for Dick Tracy to use. He had the classic two-way TV radio, which was pretty cool, but there were other technologies that were ridiculous, such as he was going to the moon, because one of his friends, an inventor, had created anti-gravity, and I think it was like magnetism or something, and it just, their technology was so ridiculously absurd, you started to feel bad for the criminals because they couldn't contend with this stuff, and it wasn't good. And they introduced Moon Maid from the moon, and he finally backed off of that stuff eventually. But there was the bigger problem, and that was that Chester Gould worked very closely with the police. He wanted to use realistic methods in his writing, and that was cool and all. But it's clear that what happened was Chester Gould started to internalize the grievances of the police and was pushing harder and harder for the idea of an authoritarian police state, where the police have the right to become judge and jury and executioner. And he would put his own ideas into the mouths of the characters who were supposed to be heroes. And at one point, I remember Chief Pat Patton, saying something along the lines of, a dead criminal is a problem solved, because then they don't have to go through the court systems. And Chester Gould was very down on the court systems, which he thought were unfair. And it really, he didn't like the idea of internal affairs. He wanted the police to have full immunity, because he believed that the police were always right. It wasn't even as much about ignoring a few bad apples just to, give the police the ability to operate as they need to. It was more like the police are just always right. Even when Dick Tracy was doing things that were not moral, he was always right because he was Dick Tracy. And it became rather distasteful at times. Particularly, sometimes Dick Tracy would start pontificating, and the things he was saying were, particularly in the 60s and 70s, were not good. And the 60s and 70s were definitely a tumultuous time in this country. And his kind of archaic thinking was not going well. And I remember it was the last three volumes, and third from the last was terrible. It was just terrible. His art was still fantastic, but his writing was really suffering, and he was trying to inject more and more of his views into the comic, with Dick Tracy as the avatar of his beliefs. And the second to the last volume actually wasn't that bad, and I was like, okay, maybe he's calmed down. Maybe the publishers have gotten kind of a hold on him. Said, okay, you need to stop this. And I was like, okay, let's hope that the final volume is good. It was terrible. And the last story was one of the worst. It had a feel like he knew that his time was... I don't think that he quit. I think he was forced out. And the story actually started off fairly well, and then it just fell apart. And it was almost like Dick Tracy knew that they wanted him out, so it was his way of giving them the middle finger and saying, you know what, I'm going to make this story the worst ever. And so it was a shame the way he went out. L.Z. Segar, for example, he died really young. And he unfortunately only had a short period of time at Popeye. And I'm not saying that if he'd have worked on it for 50 years, that, or 40 years or whatever, that he would have gone down the same route as Chester Gould, because I don't think they're at all the same type of person. But sometimes people they live long enough that their art becomes not good. But again, his physical art, the visuals, I don't think they ever lost their appeal. But definitely, and you could tell in every single one of these volumes has an introduction, probably 4 or 5 pages, and you could tell that the writers were becoming increasingly disgusted just by Chester Gould's beliefs and some of the stuff that he would write to friends in correspondence that were outside of the comic. You could see his views, and they were pretty bad. But that doesn't change his legacy, particularly in the 30s, 40s, 50s. I thought it was fantastic, and I would love to sit down and read through all of these volumes again. But I should be getting the figures any day now. They look awesome. It is Dick Tracy, and then we have also one other figure, and I can't remember the name of the figure. I don't know if we'll ever see another Dick Tracy from Mezco, because these figures were announced a long time ago, and there's not been another announced since. I couldn't even figure out. I tried to come up with who would be another figure that Mezco might make, and I wasn't really coming up with any. They look brilliant, but I just don't know if they're well known enough for Mezco. So it might be this 2-pack and one more, and then they're done. But anyway, huge fan of Chester Gould. Our political ideologies are diametrically different, but I'm not going to take away from what he did, and I definitely recommend his earlier works if you don't feel the desire to read some of his later, even though the art was still fantastic. So that's Chester Gould and Dick Tracy.